The coffee bags had been stacked in rows of 12 since 5 in the morning, and by the time the afternoon light tilted long and amber across the hillside, Don Evaristo Salinas had counted them 4 times. Not because he had forgotten the number, he had not forgotten anything in 78 years, but because counting was something his hands knew how to do, and his hands needed something to do in the hours between lunch and dark. He sat in the wooden chair outside the front door of his house, the same chair he had sat in every afternoon for 43 years. First with his wife beside him, and then, for the last 9 years, alone. The chair beside his own stood empty. It had stood empty since the 23rd of February, 9 years ago, when Remedios had sat down to drink her morning coffee and had not gotten up again. The doctors said it was quick. Don Evaristo had always believed that quick was not the same as kind. The house behind him was 11 rooms of dark brick and timber, built over 31 years of savings and harvests, expanded room by room as the coffee prices rose and the land grew more productive. There was a kitchen large enough for 3 cooks, a dining table that seated 14, a hallway that ran the full length of the house and ended at a door that had not been opened in 9 years. There were 4 guest rooms that had not seen guests in as long. There was a storage room full of Remedios's ceramic pots, her embroidered table linens, her 3 aprons still hanging from their hooks as though she had only stepped out to feed the chickens and would be back in a moment. The chickens had been sold 2 years ago. There was no longer anyone to feed them. Don Evaristo's left knee had been grinding since 1987, when he had slipped on a wet hillside during a heavy rain and heard something in the joint announce its permanent displeasure. He walked with a cane now, a thick wooden one he had carved himself from a branch of the Huanacaxle tree that grew at the edge of the eastern field, and he climbed the 3 steps to his front door with the particular deliberateness of a man who has learned the consequences of hurrying. His 3 workers, Aurelio, Beto, and old Serafin, were good men who had worked the land for between 18 and 26 years each. But they were all past 60 themselves, and the conversation between them had long since reduced itself to the necessary: how many bags, which field next, whether the weather would hold. They did not eat dinner with him. They had their own small houses at the edge of the property. The land itself was 420 hectares, of which 310 were planted with Arabica coffee in varying stages of production. The remaining 110 were secondary forest, a small stream corridor, and 2 meadows where the mules grazed. He had 14 mules. He had counted them that morning as well, for the same reason he had counted the coffee bags. The harvest season had begun 2 weeks ago, and the daily yield was running at about 2,300 kilograms of red cherry, which Aurelio and Beto and 4 seasonal workers brought down from the upper fields each afternoon on the backs of 8 of the mules. It was a good harvest. It was a harvest that Remedios had always said the land gave because the land was grateful. Don Evaristo was not sure he believed the land was capable of gratitude, but he had never argued the point with her while she was alive, and he saw no reason to argue it with her memory now. He was on his 4th count of the coffee bags: 48, 60, 72, 84, and then the stack near the pulping shed that held another 22, total 106, same as the last 3 times. When he heard footsteps on the dirt road that ran from the main gate to the house. Not the footsteps of his workers, who he knew by the sound of their boots. These were lighter. More of them. He put down the small notebook in which he had written 106 for the 4th time and looked up. There were 4 of them coming up the road. A woman in front, walking the way a person walks when they are exhausted but have decided that their body does not have permission to show it. Her back was straight, her chin was level. She wore a dark blue dress that had been washed many times and a pair of shoes that had been repaired at least once, the left sole reattached with what looked like electrical tape wound around the toe. She was carrying a cloth bag over one shoulder and had her other hand extended backward, holding the hand of a small boy who was perhaps 4 years old and was looking at everything. The coffee plants, the mules visible through the gate of the lower field, the house itself, with the pure, rotating attention of a child who has not yet learned that some things are not worth looking at. Behind them came a girl of perhaps 9, who was looking at the ground and picking up small stones as she walked and examining them before putting them in her pocket. And behind her, a boy of about 12, who was not looking at anything in particular, but walking with the careful watchfulness of someone who has recently learned that the world requires monitoring. The woman stopped at the gate. Not at the door of the house, at the wooden gate in the fence that marked the boundary of the front yard from the road. She stood there and looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. He noticed that she had walked. He could tell because of the way her shoes sat on her feet. Not the walk from the road where vehicles stopped, which was perhaps 200 meters, but a longer walk than that. The dust on her dress went up to just above the knee. The road from Chico was 14 kilometers. "Good afternoon," she said. Her voice was steady. He gave her credit for that. "Good afternoon," he said. She did not ask if she could come in. She did not ask if he was Don Evaristo Salinas, though presumably she knew since there was no other house on this road. She looked at the house behind him, all 11 rooms of it, the broad front wall, the 2 large windows on either side of the door, the covered porch that ran its full width. And then she looked back at him, and she said, "You're all alone in this big house. My children have no abuelo. That is not a trade that favors either of us. So let us fix it." Don Evaristo had been a man of the land for 56 years, which meant he had learned to recognize the difference between a storm and a light rain, between a tree that had fallen and a tree that was about to fall, between a man who was negotiating and a man who was begging. He recognized, in the way she said those words, without softening them, without adding an apology or a qualification, without dropping her eyes, that this woman was not begging. She was negotiating. She was offering something she believed had value, and she was doing it with the posture of someone who had rehearsed the words long enough to stop being afraid of them. He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at the small boy, who had not stopped examining the world around him and had now located the cat that lived under the porch and was pointing at it with the focused urgency of a child who believes that adults need to be informed about cats immediately. He looked at the girl with the stones in her pocket, who had stopped picking up stones and was now looking at the house with an expression he could not quite read. Not hunger, not longing. Something more like the way a person looks at a piece of machinery they have never seen before and are trying to understand how it works. He looked at the older boy who was watching him, not with challenge, with attention. Don Evaristo picked up his cane, set it against the arm of the chair, and stood up with the effortful dignity of a man whose knee had been expressing its opinion for 37 years. "Come in," he said. "Have coffee first. I will decide after." He walked to the gate and opened it himself, which he had not needed to do for anyone in some time, and stood to one side. The woman, he did not yet know her name, passed through with her head still level and her back still straight. The small boy came through at a run, heading directly for the cat with the purposeful disregard for adult priorities that is the exclusive property of 4-year-olds. The girl walked through slowly, still looking at the house. The older boy passed through last and glanced back at the road, the way people look back at a road they have come a long way on and are not sure they will go back down. Don Evaristo closed the gate. In the kitchen, he put water on the stove. He had learned to make his own coffee in the 9 years since Remedios, and it was not as good as hers, but it was not bad. And he set out 4 cups and then considered and added a 5th, smaller one, and filled it with warm water and a spoon of sugar for the small boy who was now sitting on the kitchen floor having a conversation of enormous mutual incomprehensibility with the cat. The woman sat across from him at the kitchen table and said, "My name is Marisol Fuentes. I am from Jico. My husband died 18 months ago, a truck accident on the highway to Puebla. His name was Gerardo. We had rented a room there, 3 rooms actually, but the owner sold the building and the new owner wanted us out by the 1st of October. I had until yesterday." How long did you walk? Don Evaristo asked.
We left at 5 this morning, she said.
He did the calculation. 9 hours, approximately, with 3 children, one of them 4 years old, and a wooden chest, which he now noticed had been left outside the gate. She had not brought it in. He respected that. It meant she was not assuming. The older boy, he said.
Tomas. He is 12. The girl is Lucia. She is 9. She paused. The one discussing philosophy with your cat is Rafael. We call him Rafa. He is 4, and he is afraid of nothing, which is both his greatest quality and my primary source of anxiety.
Don Evaristo poured the coffee. He set a cup in front of her. He did not say anything for a while, and she did not fill the silence, which he noted as well. What did you do before? He asked.
Work. My husband and I worked on a coffee plantation outside Coatepec for 6 years before we moved to Chico.
I can pick, I can sort, I can manage a drying patio, I can cook for as many people as you need. I can keep accounts if you have a system. Tomas can already do figures faster than most adults I have met. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. I am not asking you to take care of us. I am asking you to let us take care of things here, in exchange for a place to be. The kitchen was quiet except for Rafa's ongoing negotiation with the cat and the sound of Lucia, who had gotten up from her chair without asking and was standing in the doorway to the hallway, looking down its length. She had not gone in. She was only looking. The hallway ends at the door, Don Evaristo said without turning around. I see that, Lucia said. She came back and sat down. Don Evaristo drank his coffee. Outside, the late afternoon light was turning the hillside the deep gold orange it turned every October, the color that Remedios had always said made the land look like it was lit from inside. He had not been able to look at that color for several years without feeling it press against something behind his sternum. He looked at it now. There are 4 empty rooms, he said. The house rules are mine. The work rules are mine. You stay 2 weeks first. After 2 weeks, we talk again. He set down his cup. The chest, outside. Your son can bring it in. Marisol Fuentes looked at him across the table. Her eyes were the particular kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep. The tired that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time. But there was something else underneath it, something that had not been extinguished, and he recognized it because Remedios had had it too. The particular stubbornness of a person who has decided to keep going. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. I said 2 weeks, but even as he said it, he heard his own voice and knew, with the certainty of a man who has spent 78 years learning to read land and weather and silence, that he had already decided. He simply had not yet told himself. That evening, after the children had been shown to 2 of the empty rooms and Marisol had insisted on washing the coffee cups before she went to bed, Don Evaristo sat on the porch in his chair in the dark. The chair beside him was still empty. He had not moved it, and he would not. But Rafa, who had been put to bed and had apparently decided that this instruction was advisory rather than mandatory, came out through the screen door on bare feet and, without asking anything, sat down on the porch floor beside Don Evaristo's chair. Not on the other chair, on the floor next to his feet, and looked out at the darkness the same way Don Evaristo was looking at it. Don Evaristo looked down at the child. The child did not look up. They sat like that for perhaps 10 minutes, until Marisol appeared in the doorway and said quietly, Rafa. And Rafa got up without argument and went back inside. Don Evaristo sat alone again, but the floor beside his chair still held the small, warm shape of where a child had been sitting, and for reasons he was not prepared to examine, he did not feel like counting anything. The first morning established the terms of the friction. Don Evaristo rose at 4:30, as he had risen at 4:30 for 50 years, and came into the kitchen to find that someone had already made coffee.
Not his coffee, which he made in the old clay pot that had been on the stove since Remedios bought it at the market in Coatepec in 1978, but coffee made in the aluminum percolator that had been sitting unused in the cabinet above the refrigerator since his wife put it there sometime in the mid-90s. The coffee from the aluminum percolator was better than his, and he was not pleased about this. Marisol was at the back of the house sorting through the storage area, which had accumulated 40 years of tools, rope, canvas sacks, and the particular archaeological sediment of things that were broken or superseded but too useful to throw away. She had not asked permission to do this. He had not given it. He stood in the doorway of the storage room, and she turned and looked at him with the expression of a person who has been waiting to be told they've done something wrong and has decided to maintain their position regardless. "The percolator," he said. "It was in the cabinet," she said. "I cleaned it. The coffee from the clay pot takes 22 minutes and leaves grounds in the cup." "I know how long it takes," he said. "I like the grounds." There was a pause. "I will make the clay pot coffee every morning," she said, "and the percolator will be there if you want it." He looked at her. She looked at him. He decided this was an acceptable resolution and went to pour his clay pot coffee, which was already made and sitting on the back burner under a cloth because she had apparently made both. This was, he would later understand, characteristic of Marisol Fuentes. She rarely abandoned a position, but she always offered a middle path, and the middle path was always thoughtful enough that refusing it would have required a degree of obstinacy even he could not sustain. The children spread through the house and the property the way water finds its level, not intrusively but inevitably, filling the spaces that were empty. Tomás attached himself to the work of the harvest with a seriousness that surprised the seasonal workers, who were accustomed to the children of various people occasionally appearing on the property and contributing nothing except noise. Tomás contributed nothing except a notebook, in which he began writing down times and quantities and the names of which workers had picked in which sections of which fields, cross-referencing it with the weight tickets from the receiving station, and asking questions with the unembellished directness of a child who has not yet learned that questions can be impolite. "Why does Field 7 always come in lower than Field 6? He asked Don Evaristo on the third day. "The slope," Don Evaristo said. "Field 6 gets the morning sun." "But Field 7 is closer to the stream. Shouldn't the moisture compensate?" Don Evaristo looked at the boy for a moment. "You've been looking at the fields." "I walked all of them yesterday afternoon," Tomás said, "while the others were at lunch." Don Evaristo did not say that this was remarkable for a 12-year-old, because he had discovered early in life that telling children they were remarkable for their age was the fastest way to make them self-conscious about the thing they were doing naturally. He said, "Field 7 has a drainage problem on the eastern side. It's been there for about 15 years. I keep meaning to address it." "I drew a map," Tomás said, and produced the notebook. The map was not a professional survey, but it was accurate. The boy had walked the field boundaries and sketched the contours with the instinctive spatial sense of someone who had grown up watching the land rather than a screen. Don Evaristo studied it for a long time, standing in the morning sun with his cane planted in the earth, and felt something shift very slightly in his chest. Not sentimentality, but recognition. The recognition of a quality he had seen before, in himself at that age, and had not expected to see again. He said nothing. He kept the notebook. Lucia was a different kind of presence. Where Tomás was focused and purposeful, Lucia was horizontal. She paid attention to everything at once, with the roving curiosity of a creature that believes all information is eventually relevant. She picked up objects and examined them before putting them down. She opened cabinets and closed them without taking anything. She spent an entire afternoon sitting in the drying patio watching the coffee beans spread and listening to the sound the rake made when Beto turned them. And when Beto asked her what she was doing, she said she was learning what the sound meant. Beto, who had been turning drying coffee for 24 years, did not have an answer to this, and so He showed her how to tell by the sound and the resistance whether the beans needed another pass or could be left.
She learned it in 2 sessions. Beto told Don Evaristo this as though reporting an anomaly he did not know how to classify. "Let her do it," Don Evaristo said. "She's 9. I know how old she is." The cat, whose name was Café, and who had lived under the porch for 3 years and been mostly indifferent to all human beings, including Don Evaristo, became Rafa's devoted companion within 48 hours, which Rafa accepted as his natural due. Rafa also became, with no apparent effort or intention, a kind of ambassador between the 2 territories of the house, carrying items from one room to another, appearing suddenly at Don Evaristo's elbow with objects he had found and deemed worthy of presentation, asking questions that were both unanswerable and somehow correct. On the 5th morning, he appeared beside Don Evaristo's chair at breakfast, holding a small rock that did, in fact, contain a visible trace of mineral crystal, and placed it on the table beside the old man's coffee cup without saying anything. Don Evaristo looked at the rock. "It's shiny inside," Rafa said. "It is," Don Evaristo said. Rafa went back to wherever he had come from. The rock stayed on the table. Don Evaristo did not move it. The friction of the first week was mostly logistical. Marisol reorganized the kitchen by putting things where she could reach them easily, which meant that Don Evaristo could no longer reach them without bending, which his back refused to facilitate. She put the salt too high. She moved the coffee measuring scoop from the hook beside the stove to the drawer beside the sink, which meant he spent 2 mornings looking for it. He did not say anything about these things directly, which meant that the tension expressed itself as silence. And Marisol, who was perceptive, noticed the silence and asked him on the 8th evening what was wrong. He told her about the salt in the scoop. She moved them back. Then she said, "If you tell me where things belong when you move them, I will leave them there." "I didn't move them," he said. "You moved them." "I know," she said. "But I meant, if I accidentally move something, tell me, and I'll put it back." He accepted this. It was, again, a middle path. The thing that nearly broke the arrangement, the thing that could have ended it in the 2nd week and sent them back down the 14-kilometer road before the 2 weeks were up, had nothing to do with the salt or the scoop or the aluminum percolator. It had to do with the numbers. Don Evaristo had kept his own accounts for 40 years. He recorded income and expenses in a ledger, not a modern spreadsheet, not a software program, but a physical ledger with columns ruled by hand, one that he updated every evening by the light of the lamp on his desk. It was his system, and it was accurate, and he trusted it. Tomas had been given access to the harvest records, the daily weight tickets, the picker tallies, as part of learning how the harvest worked. He had not been given access to the main ledger. He found it anyway, on the evening of the 12th day, because Don Evaristo had left it open on the desk while he went to speak with Aurelio about a mule that had been limping, and Tomas, passing by the open door of the office, seeing columns of numbers, and being constitutionally incapable of walking past columns of numbers without examining them, had stopped and looked. What he found was not an error by Don Evaristo. What he found was something more delicate. A discrepancy between the weight recorded in the main ledger for the week of October 7th and the weight he had personally recorded on his own notebook from the daily tickets that same week. The ledger showed 4,100 kilograms for that week. Tomas's records showed 4,580 kilograms, a difference of 480 kilograms. At current prices, approximately 2,900 pesos. He did not know what to do with this information. He knew that the weight tickets were issued by the receiving station, which meant they were external records not subject to anyone's adjustment. He knew that his own notebook could contain errors, though he had checked it twice. He knew that the difference was significant enough to matter, but not so enormous that it could be explained by a simple arithmetic mistake in the ledger. He also knew that the ledger was Don Evaristo's, that the man had kept it for 40 years.
and that the person most likely to have made the adjustment between the weight tickets and the ledger was one of the three workers, the one who brought the daily totals to Don Evaristo for entry. That worker was Aurelio. Tomas had been in this house for 12 days. He was 12 years old. He did not know Aurelio's history, his loyalty, or what kind of position he occupied in Don Evaristo's trust. He knew that his mother had brought him here with 2 weeks on trial, and that they were 2 days from the end of those 2 weeks. He knew that the safest thing to do, the thing that would absolutely not cause any disruption, was to close the ledger, walk away, say nothing, and keep the information quietly in his notebook in case it became relevant later. He thought about this for approximately 4 minutes. Then he picked up the ledger, carried it to the kitchen where Don Evaristo had come back from his conversation with Aurelio and was pouring a second cup of coffee, and set it on the table. "I need to show you something," he said. His voice was steady enough, though his hands were not entirely. He opened the ledger to the week of October 7th. He set his own notebook beside it. He pointed to the 2 numbers, 4,100, 4,580. He did not say anything else. He waited. Don Evaristo set down his coffee cup and looked at both pages for a long time. He did not look at Tomas. He pulled the ledger closer and ran his finger down the column, then picked up his own pen and did the calculation on the margin of the page. He set the pen down. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he said, "Get me the weight tickets, the physical ones from the receiving station." Tomas went to the storage room where the tickets were filed and came back with the October folder. Don Evaristo went through them one by one, adding them in the margin of the page. 4,580 kilograms. The old man was quiet for a long time, long enough that the kitchen felt different, weighted, airless. Then he closed the ledger, looked at Tomas, and said, "How long have you known?" "Since tonight," Tomas said. "I wouldn't have waited if I'd known longer." Don Evaristo studied the boy's face with the same thoroughness he'd applied to the weight tickets. Then he slid the ledger across the table. "From now on," he said, "you keep this." Tomas looked at the ledger and then back at the old man. "The whole thing?" "Cross-reference it with the tickets every week. If the numbers don't match, you tell me the same day, not the next day. The same day." "What about Aurelio?" Don Evaristo was quiet for a moment. "That is my matter, not yours. Your matter is the numbers. Keep them honest." Tomas pulled the ledger toward him. It was heavy. 40 years of columns and harvests and prices and costs. The full record of a life's work. He held it the way a person holds something they understand the weight of. He never found another discrepancy. Don Evaristo never explained what he said to Aurelio, and Tomas never asked. But Aurelio began bringing the daily totals directly to Tomas rather than to the ledger, and the weight tickets matched every week without exception for the entirety of the harvest season. At the end of the 2 weeks, Don Evaristo said nothing about a second conversation. He said nothing about the terms they had discussed at the kitchen table on the first evening. He said, on a Tuesday morning, pouring clay pot coffee into his cup, "Lucia needs school shoes. There is a shoe shop in Jico. The truck goes down on Thursdays." He put a folded bill on the table without specifying the amount. Then he went outside. Marisol looked at the bill on the table. It was 250 pesos. More than shoes would cost, but not insultingly more. It was the amount of a person who had thought about the question rather than guessing. She picked it up and said nothing. That was the end of the 2-week trial. Neither of them mentioned it again. November came in with heat that should have belonged to September, and the upper fields, the ones above 900 meters where the Arabica grown at altitude had the particular dense sweetness that buyers from the processing cooperative in Coatepec paid a premium for, needed to be picked fast, before the red cherry began to overripen on the branch. Don Evaristo had been climbing to the upper fields for 56 years.
He knew every switchback in the mule path, every soft section where the earth gave underfoot after rain, every place where the morning mist sat longest and the picking window was shortest. He was also 78 years old, with a left knee that ground like a millstone on flat ground, and a heart that his doctor in Hiko had described at his last checkup 14 months ago as compensating well, but not infinitely. He had not gone back to the doctor since then, partly because the road to Hiko was 20 minutes by truck, and the truck was not always available, and partly because he had found, over the last several years, that what the doctors told him was invariably true and invariably unhelpful, since the recommendations, rest more, carry less, climb less, were recommendations for a different man's life, not his. He went up to the upper fields on the 9th of November with Aurelio and one of the seasonal workers, leaving at 6 in the morning with 2 mules loaded with empty sacks. Marisol had asked the night before if she and Tomas should come. He had said he didn't need them on the upper fields. The path was steep and Tomas should stay with the drying patio. She had looked at him in a way that suggested she had a different opinion, but was choosing for now to keep it. He made it to the upper fields by 7:30. The coffee was, as he had expected, at the edge of its picking window, deep red, some beginning to darken toward purple. He and Aurelio and the seasonal worker moved through the first section quickly, stripping the ripe cherry with the practiced speed of people who have done it 10,000 times. The mules stood patient in the shade of a large tepehilote palm, ears rotating slowly in the way mules have when they are comfortable and have no immediate plans. By 10 o'clock, they had filled 460 kilograms in sacks, which the seasonal worker was beginning to load onto the mules for the first trip down. Don Evaristo moved into the second section of the upper field, deeper in, where the slope was more pronounced and the footing required attention. He had walked this section in boots that had been repaired twice and were due for a third repair, and the left boot near the toe had a slight separation in the sole that he had been aware of for approximately 3 weeks and had not gotten around to addressing. The root he didn't see was the kind that grows across a path horizontally, barely above the surface, the color of the dried earth, visible only if you were looking for it. He was looking at the coffee plants, not the path. His right foot caught it. His cane went to the left. His left knee, asked suddenly to absorb more weight than it was prepared for, declined the invitation with a sensation that went from his knee to his jaw in approximately half a second. He sat down on the hillside more abruptly than he had sat down anywhere since he was a child, and the world went briefly white and then gray, and then he became aware of a pressure in the center of his chest that was different from the pain in his knee, older, heavier, more serious. He had been here before, in a smaller way. The doctor had described it as angina, the heart's way of asking for a pause. He breathed slowly, the way he had learned to breathe when this happened. 4 counts in, 4 counts out. Don't fight it. Don't move yet. Aurelio, who had looked back at the sound of the fall, was beside him in 30 seconds. Don Evaristo, I'm sitting, he said. I am aware that I am sitting. Give me a moment. Your face. My face is fine. The knee is not fine. Give me a moment. The pressure in his chest did not go away. It settled, became a weight rather than a sharp thing, which was somewhat better and somewhat worse. After 4 minutes of the breathing exercise, he tried to stand and found that his knee, in addition to the chronic damage, had acquired something new and acute during the fall, something that made standing a negotiation rather than an action. Aurelio got him upright with a hand under his arm, and they stood there on the hillside at 1,040 meters above sea level, assessing the situation together. The mules were at the bottom of this section. The path down was 800 meters, with the worst sections in the first 200. The seasonal worker had already gone down with the first load. Call him back up, Don Evaristo said. Don Evaristo, we should call him back up and call Beto on the radio and tell him to... He did not finish the sentence. The weight in his chest was not diminishing with the breathing,
which meant it was not the ordinary kind of pressure, but something that required more than breathing. He knew this. He had known it since approximately the 3rd minute. "Call the house," he said. Aurelio had the radio. He called. Marisol picked up on the 2nd transmission. He heard Aurelio explain briefly, and he heard her voice say something that was cut off by the radio. And then there was silence for a moment. And then, "Stay with him. I'm coming up." Aurelio said, "Signora, the path." "I know the path," she said. "I walked it twice last week to see what state it was in. Stay with him." She arrived in 22 minutes, which meant she had run most of the way. She arrived breathing hard, but not out of control, and she looked at Don Evaristo sitting on a flat section of earth beside a coffee plant, and said nothing dramatic. She looked at his color. She put 2 fingers on the inside of his wrist. She asked him to describe what he felt in his chest. He described it. "That is not a heart attack," she said. "But it is not nothing. We need to get you down." "I know we need to get down," he said, with a degree of testiness that he immediately recognized as the testiness of a frightened man, which he resented. "I'm going to help you stand. Put your arm across my shoulders, not Aurelio's, because I'm closer to your height and the angle is better. Aurelio, take the cane and walk on his left side. We will go slowly." She was not, in fact, much closer to his height. She was a good 20 centimeters shorter, but the angle of her shoulder under his arm was steadier than Aurelio's because she distributed his weight differently, and they began to move down the path. 800 meters. The first 200 were the worst. Loose earth, the root sections, 2 switchbacks where the path narrowed to less than a meter. She did not hurry him. She adjusted her pace to his without being asked. When his knee nearly gave on the first switchback, she moved her weight under his without instruction, the way a good mule moves under a shifting load, not fighting it, absorbing it. He did not say anything for most of the descent. There was nothing to say. He was being helped down a mountain by a woman he had known for 23 days, and he was too tired to find the dignity to resist it. And on some level that he was not examining closely, he was aware that resisting it would have been the wrong thing to do. They reached the lower path after 45 minutes. By the time they got to the truck, the pressure in his chest had reduced, but not gone. Beto had brought the truck to the closest point on the road. Marisol helped him into the passenger seat and told Aurelio to stay with the mules and the upper field. The seasonal workers would continue, and Tomas knew what to do with the weight tickets, and she got into the driver's seat. "You can drive the truck?" Don Evaristo said.
"My husband drove trucks for 6 years,"
she said. "I learned because he worked nights." She drove. He did not say anything about her driving, which was competent and careful, and she did not say anything about the fact that his hand on the door handle was gripping it with the controlled force of a man trying not to show that he was frightened. The hospital in Chico confirmed what she had estimated. Not a myocardial infarction, but significant anginal episode. The heart in negotiation, as the cardiologist put it, rather than in crisis. They gave him medication, monitored him for the rest of the afternoon and through the night, and would keep him for 2 more days for observation and tests. Marisol stayed. She called the house. Tomas answered because he was 12 and had been waiting, and told him what had happened, told him the workers knew what to do with the afternoon harvest, told him Lucia was in charge of dinner and there was chicken in the refrigerator and rice in the container beside the stove. She told him she would be back when Don Evaristo was back, and not before. "How long?" Tomas asked. 2 or 3 days, she said. There was a pause on the line. "Okay," Tomas said. "We'll be fine." "I know you will," she said. "Keep the ledger." "I know," he said. She slept the first night in a chair in the corridor outside Don Evaristo's room, which the hospital's night nurse did not officially allow and unofficially tolerated because Marisol had explained the situation in a way that made it clear she was not a person who was going to be argued into leaving. The second night, she found a bench in the waiting area that was slightly less vertical. The third morning, Don Evaristo was discharged with 4 new prescriptions.
instructions to climb no hillsides steeper than 30 degrees, and a referral to a cardiologist in Jalapa that he had already decided he would not use. On the truck ride back, he said, "You didn't have to stay." "I know," she said. "The children were alone for 3 days." "Tomas is 12, she said. "He is more capable than most 30-year-olds I have known." "And Lucia had the cat." He was quiet for a while. "The chicken," he said, "in the refrigerator." "What about it?" "I was going to use it for Sunday. Remedios's recipe for pollo and mole verde." Marisol was quiet for a moment. "I have her recipe book," she said. "I found it in the kitchen drawer." He turned to look at her. "I didn't open it," she said. "I saw it was hers and I put it back in the drawer." He looked out the window at the road. "The chicken will keep until Sunday," he said. She said nothing. They drove the last 8 kilometers in silence that was not uncomfortable, the silence of two people who have been through something together and do not need to narrate it. When they arrived at the house, the front yard had been swept. The steps had been cleared of the coffee chaff that accumulated during harvest and was normally not addressed until weekend. The front door was open, and the smell coming from inside was beans and something sweet. Piloncillo, he thought, in the beans, which was how Remedios had always made them. Rafa was sitting on the front steps. When the truck came up the road, he stood up and watched it park, and when Don Evaristo got out with his cane, he walked down the 2 steps and stood next to the old man's hand without saying anything, the way he had sat beside his feet on the porch that first night. Not holding the hand, just standing beside it. Don Evaristo looked down at him. "You're back," Rafa said. "I'm back," Don Evaristo said. He went inside, and Tomas met him in the hallway, with the ledger already under his arm to give a report on the 3 days of harvest, and Lucia came out of the kitchen with a dish towel in her hand and looked at him with that expression that was not quite worry and not quite relief, but something that contained both. And Don Evaristo stood in the hallway of his 11-room house with his cane and his new prescriptions, and the harvest continuing on the hill outside, and something in his chest, different from the pressure in the upper field, shifted and settled into a new position. That evening, after dinner, after the children were in their rooms, he sat in his chair on the porch. The night air was cool and smelled of earth and coffee pulp and the distant rain that the hills were catching on their western slopes. He reached into the pocket of his shirt where he kept his keys and felt, as he always did, the single key on the separate ring, the key to the room at the end of the hall. He had not opened that room in 9 years. He had told himself, in the years after Remedios died, that the reason he kept the room locked was because he was not ready. And then, later, that the reason was because there was no reason to open it. There was nothing in there he needed. And then, later still, he had stopped explaining the reason to himself at all. The key was in his pocket, and the door was locked, and he carried the key because putting it somewhere else would have meant making a decision he was not yet making. He had been asleep, exhausted from the hospital and the medication, when it happened. He did not know this until the next morning. Lucia had been the one who found it. She told him herself, coming to him in the kitchen where he was eating breakfast, standing in the doorway with her hands behind her back in the posture of a person who is about to say something they are uncertain how to say.
"Yesterday, when you were sleeping," she said, "your key fell out of your pocket. It was on the floor by the chair." He set down his coffee cup. "I picked it up," she said. "I saw which door it was for." She paused. "I didn't open it. I put it back in your pocket." Don Evaristo looked at her for a long moment. She was 9 years old, and she was standing in his kitchen doorway, having just told him something that required more self-restraint than most adults he had ever known would have managed. To hold in your hand the key to a locked door and not turn it when you are 9 years old and you want to know what is inside everything. "Why didn't you open it?" he asked. "Because it wasn't mine to open," she said, as though this were obvious.
He was quiet for a while. The kitchen light came through the east window at this hour in the particular sharp-edged way it came in November, making the table and the clay coffee pot and the small bowl of piloncillo on the counter look very clear and very specific. He pushed back from the table. He stood up with the cane. "Come," he said. He walked down the hallway and she followed him, and he stopped at the door at the end. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out the key. He put it in the lock. He turned it, and the door opened with the particular sound of a door that has been closed for a long time. A slight resistance, then a release, as though something had been holding its breath. The room was dim. He found the light switch, and the single bulb came on, and the room was revealed. Not large, perhaps 4 meters by 5, with a single window whose curtain he had never opened. Against the far wall was the loom, Remedios's loom, the large floor loom with its wooden beams and heddles and the warp thread still tensioned from the last time she had sat at it. And on the loom, still threaded and still unfinished, a tablecloth in deep blue and white, the pattern she had been working on in the last months before she died. It was perhaps 2/3 complete. The threads she had been using last were still hanging from the heddle, as though she had set them down to go get a cup of coffee and would be back. She had gone to get a cup of coffee. She had not come back. Lucia stood beside him and looked at the loom for a long time. She walked forward slowly, the way she walked toward everything she wanted to examine, and crouched down and looked at the weaving up close without touching it. "She was making a tablecloth," she said. "For the Christmas table," he said. "She always made something for the Christmas table." Lucia straightened up and looked at the threads, the pattern, the distance between where the weaving ended and where the full tablecloth would have ended. "I could learn," she said, "if you showed me how, or if there was a book." Don Evaristo looked at the loom. He had not looked at it in 9 years. He had not been in this room. He had opened the door because a 9-year-old child had held a key in her hand and put it back in his pocket, and that act of restraint had been, in some way he could not fully articulate, the most complete expression of respect anyone had shown him since his wife died. "There is a book," he said. "Remedios's weaving book. She kept it on the shelf in the kitchen." "I know which one," Lucia said. "I didn't open it." He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was related to one. "I know you didn't." He left the room but did not lock it again. The key, when he reached for it that evening, was in his pocket, as always, but he left it where it was and did not lock the door. The next morning, the door was still open. He walked past it and did not close it. 2 days later, Lucia was sitting at the loom with the weaving book propped against the beam, learning the threading sequence with the careful attention she brought to everything she decided mattered. Some things unlock only when they are not forced. Don Evaristo had known this about the land for 50 years. He had not known until now that it was also true of himself. December brought the end of the main harvest and the beginning of the lighter second pass through the lower fields, where a secondary flush of late cherry ripened on the shaded plants below 700 meters. It was not the premium harvest. The cooperative paid less per kilogram for the late cherry, but it was still income, and in the year Marisol and her children had arrived, the total harvest weight was running 11% above the previous year's figure, which Tomás had calculated and presented to Don Evaristo in a handwritten summary that included a comparison with the 3 previous years, and a note that the improvement in the eastern field, where Don Evaristo had finally addressed the drainage problem using Tomás's map and 4 days of labor from Beto and the seasonal workers, had contributed approximately 600 additional kilograms to the season's total. Don Evaristo read the summary twice. He added it to the ledger folder. He had taken to showing Tomás things on the property, not formally, not as lessons, but as the natural side effect of walking somewhere and finding the boy beside him. How to read the color of a coffee leaf for nitrogen deficiency. How to check the condition of the pulping machine drum before the harvest season began.
how to calculate the conversion rate between wet cherry weight and dry parchment weight,
which required knowing the moisture content of the crop and making a judgment that was part formula and part experience. Tomas absorbed these things with the same systematic attention he brought to the ledger, asking exactly as many questions as necessary and no more. And Don Evaristo found that explaining something he had known for decades required him to examine why he knew it, which was an exercise he had not expected to find useful at 78, and did. Marisol had, over the course of 2 months, taken over the management of the household with a competence that Don Evaristo would not have described as remarkable, because that would have required acknowledging how unremarkable the previous 9 years had been by comparison. She cooked in a way that was different from Remedios, not better or worse, different, with her own preferences and techniques, chilies she liked that Remedios hadn't used, and combinations that were not in Remedios's recipe book, but were nonetheless correct. She repaired 3 windows that had been leaking for 2 years. She organized the payment records for the seasonal workers in a way that Don Evaristo could actually find things in, which had not previously been the case. She drove the truck to Jico on Thursdays for supplies and came back with receipts and change that always reconciled, which Don Evaristo verified the first 3 times and then stopped verifying. He had not discussed the matter of the thefts from the ledger with her. He had not discussed it with anyone, and he intended to discuss it with no one. Aurelio had continued to work, efficiently and without incident, since the week after Tomas showed Don Evaristo the discrepancy. Don Evaristo had said to Aurelio once, privately, "The boy keeps the ledger now." Aurelio had said nothing. The weight tickets had matched every week since. Don Evaristo did not believe in dramatic confrontations when a quiet understanding accomplished the same result. And he understood that a man of 63 who had worked a piece of land for 26 years might have made an error in judgment that deserved a correction without a punishment. This was not the philosophy of a man who was naive about human nature. It was the philosophy of a man who had learned, over a long life, the difference between justice and cruelty. The posadas began on the 16th of December, as they always did in the small towns of Veracruz. The 9 nights of celebration before Christmas, the processions and the songs and the breaking of piñatas, the smell of ponche and tamales from every house. The workers went down to Jico with their families on the first posada night. Don Evaristo had not participated in posadas since Remedios died. He sat on the porch that evening while the distant sound of a guitarrón and singing drifted up the hill from the direction of the town, and Marisol came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat, not in the empty chair. She never sat in the empty chair, but on the porch steps, and they listened to the sound together. "We used to go every year," he said, not to her specifically, more to the air. "Would you like to go this year?" she asked. He thought about it. "Not yet," he said. She nodded and didn't say anything else, and he noted again that she had the rare quality of not filling silences with noise. It was on the 18th of December that the car from Zalapa arrived. Don Evaristo was in the office with the ledger when he heard the engine. Not the sound of his own truck or the cooperative's pickup, but something newer, with the slightly higher whine of a vehicle that runs on city roads and is unused to the corrugations of a mountain track. He looked out the window and saw a silver sedan stopping at the gate, and then a man getting out. 50 years old, approximately, heavier than the photographs Don Evaristo had seen over the years, wearing a collared shirt and slacks that were correct for an office and not correct for a property in the hills. And behind him, getting out of the passenger side, another man he didn't recognize, younger, carrying a leather document folder. Gilberto Salinas, the chavar from Jalapa, as his workers would have said, not quite disrespectfully, but with the particular name that Veracruz uses for someone who belongs somewhere more urban and has opinions about it. He was the closest thing Don Evaristo had to a blood relative still living. A cousin's son, second cousin, technically, whom Don Evaristo had met perhaps 8 times in his life, most recently at Remedios's funeral,
9 years ago, where Gilberto had shaken his hand and said he was sorry, and asked whether Don Evaristo had thought about what would happen to the property. Don Evaristo had thanked him for coming and said he would think about it. He had thought about it over the following 9 years. The conclusion he had reached was his own business. He heard the gate. He heard Marisol's voice in the front yard. She had apparently been near the gate when the car arrived, and then voices, and then the sound of footsteps on the porch. He set the ledger in the drawer and waited. Gilberto came in through the front door with the particular manner of a man who is trying to project family easiness and not entirely succeeding. He spread his arms slightly, not quite a hug, an approximation of warmth, and said, "Dio, I heard you had some trouble with your heart. I came as soon as I could." The trouble with his heart had been 6 weeks ago. Don Evaristo noted this without mentioning it. "Gilberto," he said, "come in. Coffee." The man behind Gilberto was introduced as a colleague. "A friend, really. He helps me with property matters." Don Evaristo looked at the document folder and said nothing. He called for Marisol and asked for coffee, and she brought it without any indication of what she thought of the visitors, which was itself, Don Evaristo recognized, a form of opinion. Gilberto asked about his health. Don Evaristo said it was fine. The medication was managing it. The doctors were satisfied. Gilberto expressed relief that was slightly more performative than genuine. He asked about the harvest, and Don Evaristo said the harvest had been the best in 3 years, which was true, and which he knew would be processed with calculation rather than pleasure. "That's wonderful," Gilberto said. "The land is really something." He looked out the window at the hillside. "It's funny. I was talking to a contact of mine who works in real estate development in this valley, and he was saying that coffee-growing land in the Veracruz highlands has been really appreciating. Something about foreign buyers looking for agroforestry investments." "Yes," Don Evaristo said. "He mentioned, I think he said 400 hectares of good Arabica land in this altitude band could be worth." Gilberto said a number. The number was not inaccurate, which told Don Evaristo that the colleague with the document folder had done the research before this visit. "Is that right?" Don Evaristo said. "Not that I'm suggesting anything, of course, just interesting." Gilberto paused, rearranged his expression into concern. Dio, I worry about you. You're alone up here, and now with the heart incident, I want to make sure you're protected." "You've mentioned that before," Don Evaristo said. "At the funeral." A brief hesitation. 9 years ago, yes. Things were different then. "Things are not different now," Don Evaristo said. "In the way you mean." Gilberto looked at the room. He looked specifically at the evidence of other people in it. The children's shoes by the door. A drawing Rafa had made that was stuck to the wall of the hallway with a piece of tape. The slight reorganization of the kitchen visible through the doorway. His expression shifted by a few degrees. "I heard you had... that there was a family staying here," he said. "Someone from Chico, was it? I want to make sure that's a comfortable arrangement for you. Sometimes people..." He searched for the careful word. "Sometimes people take advantage of situations, particularly with elderly." "Gilberto," Don Evaristo said, with the voice he had used over 56 years to stop mules, halt arguments, and end conversations that had exceeded their natural length. "I know you have driven from Jalapa, and I appreciate the visit. Tell me how your mother is." The conversation did not go where Gilberto wanted it to go. Don Evaristo answered the questions about property, health, and arrangement with the pleasant impenetrability of a man who has no obligation to explain himself and knows it. After 90 minutes, Gilberto and his colleague rose to leave. At the door, Gilberto shook his hand and said, "I just want to make sure you're protected, Dio." "I know," Don Evaristo said. Gilberto glanced one more time at the hillside. The long, slow assessment of a man calculating a thing he is not ready to stop calculating, and walked to his car.
Don Evaristo watched the silver sedan reverse down the track toward the main road. He watched it until it turned onto the asphalt and the sound of its engine faded. Then he went back inside and sat in his chair and was quiet for a while. He was not afraid of Gilberto Salinas. He had never been afraid of Gilberto Salinas. But he was also not a man who left the gate open on a night when he knew something was moving in the dark outside. He had been aware, in the general way that a man of his age and his assets is always aware, that the question of what would happen to the land and the house when he died was not merely a personal question. It was a legal one. And legal questions required legal solutions. He had an appointment already. He had made it the week after coming home from the hospital in Chico, before Gilberto's visit, before Gilberto's name had even come up. He had made it because a man who has spent a lifetime building something and who has now seen who is willing to carry him down a mountain when he falls does not need to be prompted by a cousin's son with a document folder to understand what ought to happen to what he built. The appointment was with Licenciado Fuentes, no relation to Marisol, at his office in Jico on the 22nd of December. Don Evaristo had gone alone. He had not told Marisol. He had not told anyone. He had asked Beto to drive him down, and he had sat in the Licenciado's office for 2 hours, and he had explained, with the precision of a man who has thought about something for a long time and is now simply stating it rather than arguing it, what he wanted.
A labor agreement and inheritance clause, the Licenciado had said. A labor agreement and inheritance clause. Don Evaristo had confirmed. Marisol Fuentes and her 3 children would remain on the property as workers and residents, managing the harvest and the household for a period of 5 years from the date of the signing. At the completion of 5 years, they would become the legal owners of 2/3 of the planted coffee land, 206 hectares, and the full title of the house and the surrounding grounds. The remaining third of the planted land would go to the workers' cooperative in the ejido as a communal resource. There was no mention of Gilberto Salinas in the document, because Gilberto Salinas had no claim. And documents that preemptively argue against non-existent claims are documents written by people who are afraid. Don Evaristo was not afraid. He was prepared. The Licenciado had asked whether he was certain. "I have been certain," Don Evaristo said, "for longer than you have been a lawyer." The document was signed and notarized on the 22nd of December. A copy was registered at the property office in Veracruz City the same week via courier, which the Licenciado arranged. Don Evaristo brought his copy home in the inside pocket of his jacket, put it in the drawer of his desk underneath the ledger, and said nothing. On Christmas Day, Lucia set the table with a cloth of her own making, not the blue tablecloth which was still on the loom and still unfinished, but a smaller piece she had woven herself from the extra thread in Remedios's basket, in a pattern she had adapted from the weaving book, with a border of small diamond shapes in rust and white. She placed it on the table without ceremony, the way a person does something they have made when they are more interested in whether it works than in being observed making it. Don Evaristo sat at the head of the table, as he had sat for 40 years. The chair to his right, which had always been empty, had Rafa in it. The chair to his left had Tomas. Lucia was across from him, and Marisol was at the other end of the table. They ate pollo en mole verde from Remedios's recipe, which Marisol had made from the recipe book, and which was not exactly as Don Evaristo remembered it, and was also, somehow, right. Outside, the hillside in December had its own particular quiet. The harvest done, the plants resting, the mist coming down from the upper slopes in the evening. After dinner, after the dishes were done and the children were in their rooms, Don Evaristo sat on the porch. It was cold enough for a jacket. He had his clay pot coffee and the night sounds and the distant lights of Jico visible in the valley below. Gilberto had left with a question unresolved. He had said at the car, "I just want to make sure you're protected." And there had been something in his voice that was not finished, that suggested he would return with something more concrete than real estate prices and a man with a document folder. Don Evaristo had seen that look before, in the eyes of buyers who hadn't gotten what they wanted the first time and were recalibrating.
He was not worried.
The document was registered. The law was clear. But Gilberto was a man who worked in property, which meant he was a man who understood the distance between what the law said and what a person was willing to endure to defend it. He would probe that distance. Don Evaristo drank his coffee and looked at the valley lights. He had had 9 years of this porch, 9 years of this view, 9 years to think. He had used them. Gilberto came back in the second week of January, and this time he did not bring a colleague with a document folder. He brought a lawyer, not a local licenciado from Chico or a neighboring town, but someone from Jalapa who wore a suit that was correct for a city office, carried a briefcase, and had the particular manner of a man who is paid to make other people feel uncertain about their legal position. He introduced himself as Licenciado Pedraza and shook Don Evaristo's hand with a grip calibrated to be confident rather than aggressive, and they all sat down in the front room. Don Evaristo did not offer coffee this time. He sat in the chair across the table from them and waited. Licenciado Pedraza spoke first, which was presumably what he was there to do. He spoke with the organized reasonableness of someone who has done this many times, the language of concern, of best interests, of the potential for misunderstandings, and the importance of clarity. He spoke about the rights of family members under Mexican inheritance law. He spoke about the distinction between a labor agreement and a gift, and the legal scrutiny that can be applied to agreements made by elderly persons that may reflect impaired judgment or undue influence. He spoke about the importance of ensuring that Don Evaristo's interests were truly protected. Don Evaristo listened to all of this. He had, over 78 years, listened to many people speak at length about what was in his best interest, and he had found that the longer a person spoke on this subject, the less they meant it. He let Licenciado Pedraza finish. Then he reached into his jacket and removed a folded document and set it on the table. "The labor agreement and inheritance clause," he said, "registered with the property office in Veracruz on the 27th of December, notarized by Licenciado Hugo Fuentes of Jico, whose contact information is at the bottom of the second page. The registration number is in the upper right corner. Your colleague can verify it on the state property registry this afternoon." Licenciado Pedraza picked up the document. He read it. He was a good lawyer, which meant his expression changed very little while he read, but it changed. He turned to the second page and read the registration clause. He looked at the notarization. Gilberto, who was watching the lawyer rather than the document, seemed to read something in the lawyer's posture because his own posture shifted. Don Evaristo let them read. He had nothing to add. "This is," Licenciado Pedraza said carefully, "a properly executed and registered instrument." "Yes," Don Evaristo said. "The terms are quite specific." "I was specific about them," Don Evaristo said. "I have been thinking about them for some time." There was a pause. Gilberto said, "Tio, I want you to understand that if there's any pressure being applied to you, if you're in a position where you feel you have to." "Gilberto," Don Evaristo said in the voice he used on mules and arguments and conversations that had exceeded their length, "I am 78 years old. I have worked this land for 56 years. I built this house room by room over 31 years. I have thought about what should happen to it since your great-aunt died, and I reached my conclusion before you came the first time, and your coming did not change it, and your coming again will not change it." He folded his hands on the table. "This is not a conversation about whether my decision is correct. My decision is made, and it is registered, and it is legal. If you wish to challenge it in court, that is your right. Licenciado Fuentes is aware that this possibility exists. He is prepared." He did not say this with anger. He said it the way a man states a fact about the land. Here is the slope, here is the water table, here is the boundary. Not in dispute. Licenciado Pedraza closed his briefcase. He said something quiet to Gilberto, who looked at the floor for a moment, then at the window, then at his cousin.
Don Evaristo looked at Gilberto. He looked at him not with contempt. He did not feel contempt, which would have required more energy than this warranted, but with the particular clarity of a man who sees another man plainly and has no wish to diminish him, only to finish the conversation. "Come visit sometime," Don Evaristo said, "when you are not working." Gilberto said nothing. He stood, and Licenciado Pedraza stood, and they went to the door. At the door, Gilberto turned back once, the same look as December, the long appraisal of the hillside, and Don Evaristo watched him turn away and walk to the car. The silver sedan went down the track. Don Evaristo sat until the sound of its engine was gone. He went to the kitchen and made clay pot coffee, took the full 22 minutes, left the grounds in, and drank it standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the eastern field where the drainage correction had made the soil darker and more even than it had been in 15 years. Then he set down his cup, put on his jacket, took his cane, and walked outside to find Tomas, who was in the lower drying patio turning the late cherry with Beto, notebook under his arm. "The late cherry," Don Evaristo said, stopping beside him and looking at the patio. "What do you think?" Tomas looked at the beans. "Another 2 days on this section. The section near the shed might be ready tomorrow." "That's what I think," Don Evaristo said. "Good." He walked back to the house. Behind him, he heard Tomas tell Beto something about the angle of the rake and Beto's gruff agreement, and the steady sound of raking continuing. He climbed his 3 steps. The land went on exactly as it should. Cảnh B, 5 tháng và những cột mốc trưởng thành. The years that followed had the quality of good harvests, not easy, not without difficulty, but marked by a pattern of growth that was visible only when you stepped back and looked at the whole season rather than any individual week. Tomas turned 13 and then 14, and by the time he was 15, the cooperative's buyer had started asking for him specifically when negotiating the annual price. Because he had learned to present the quality data, moisture content, defect rate, screen size, with a precision that made price arguments both easier to make and harder to counter. At 16, he rode the bus to Jalapa to attend a 2-day workshop on specialty coffee grading, run by a regional exporters association, and came back with a certificate and a contact at a direct trade roaster in Mexico City who was looking for microlot Arabica from verified altitude origins. Don Evaristo reviewed the roaster's proposal and said, "What do you think the right price is?" Tomas said a number. Don Evaristo said it was the right number. The first microlot sale was 420 kilograms at a price 43% higher than the cooperative rate, and Tomas wrote the figure in the ledger with the precise handwriting he had developed over 3 years of keeping accounts. 17 brought the drainage project in the upper field. Not just the correction Don Evaristo had made in the first year, but a larger terracing plan that Tomas had drawn based on a topographic survey he had done himself over 3 weekends with a borrowed level and a notebook. Don Evaristo looked at the plan for a long time and asked 2 questions about the soil stability on the eastern bank. Tomas had answers for both questions. They hired 2 workers from the ejido for the terracing, and it took 14 days. And when the next harvest came in, the upper field produced 280 kilograms more than the year before. Don Evaristo said, looking at the weight ticket, "You'll want to document the method for the next time someone has a drainage problem." "I already wrote it up," Tomas said, and produced 8 pages of notes. Lucia completed the blue tablecloth when she was 12. It took her 2 years, working on it in the mornings before school and on weekend afternoons, consulting the weaving book and, in the later stages, consulting nothing but her own judgment. It was not identical to what Remedios had been making.
The pattern had shifted slightly in the third section where Lucia had needed to improvise around a section where the original threads had weakened with age. But it was, unmistakably, a continuation of the same work. She took it off the loom on a Saturday morning and carried it to Don Evaristo, who was in the office, and set it on his desk without saying anything. He looked at it for a long time. "The third section is different," he said. "I know," she said. "The thread broke. I had to adapt." "It's better," he said. He said this without inflation, as a man states something about a coffee plant that has responded well to pruning. "I don't know about better," Lucia said. "It's finished." He folded it carefully. On Christmas Eve that year, he carried it to the dining room and spread it on the table himself, the way he had seen Remedios spread the table linens before a holiday meal, slowly, smoothing the edges with the palm of his hand. When everyone sat down to dinner, the tablecloth was on the table, blue and white and rust-bordered, filling the full length of the table from one end to the other. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody needed to. Lucia was still working at the loom, her own work now, not Remedios's. She had begun making things to sell at the market in Jico, small woven pieces, bags, the geometric borders that were native to this part of Veracruz, and she sold them every Thursday with a steadiness that surprised the market regulars, because she was 14 and she priced her work correctly, which was not what most first-time market vendors did. She was also, somehow, simultaneously taking the highest marks in her class at the secondary school in Jico, which she attended on the town bus, and from which she returned every afternoon with her school bag over one shoulder and a new stone in her pocket that she had found on the road and considered interesting. She kept her stones in a shallow wooden bowl on the windowsill of her room. There were, by the time she was 14, 63 stones in the bowl. Don Evaristo had never commented on this. He had once picked one up and turned it over and set it down, and she had said, "That one has pyrite in it." And he had said, "I thought it might." And they had moved on. Rafa grew the way children grow when they are safe and fed and know where they are. Steadily, without drama, filling out in all directions at once. By 6, he knew the names of every coffee variety planted on the property and which sections they occupied. By 7, he knew which plants needed grafting and approximately when. By 8, he had begun doing the grafting himself, under Beto's supervision, with the small, precise movements of a child who has been taught to work carefully and has decided that careful is the only way worth doing anything. At 9, he showed Don Evaristo a section of the east lower field where 4 plants were showing early signs of coffee leaf rust, a reddish-orange powder on the undersides of the leaves that preceded the defoliation that could take out a section of field in a bad year. "How long have you been watching them?" Don Evaristo asked. 2 weeks, Rafa said. "I wanted to be sure before I told you." Don Evaristo crouched down with some difficulty and looked at the leaves. The rust was early enough that targeted copper treatment would contain it without spreading to neighboring plants. "Good eyes," he said. "Beto showed me what to look for," Rafa said, "but I found it myself." "That's usually how it works," Don Evaristo said. Marisol, in those years, became something that Don Evaristo would not have known to want and would not have known to name. Not a daughter, not a worker, not a manager, though she was all of those things. She was the person who knew where everything was. She knew when the truck needed its injectors cleaned before it showed symptoms. She knew which of the seasonal workers had a family difficulty that would affect their reliability during harvest. She knew when Don Evaristo's knee was worse than usual by the way he held his cane, slightly closer to the body, less swing in the step. And she arranged, without announcement, for Beto to handle anything that required going up to the upper fields on those days. She learned Remedios's mole verde well enough that Don Evaristo could no longer distinguish it from memory, which he told her once, simply. And she said, simply, that she was glad. And that was the whole of the conversation. She drove him to the cardiologist in Jalapa in the second year,
having arranged the appointment herself after his HICO doctor mentioned that the Jalapa referral had still not been followed up. He did not argue about this. The cardiologist adjusted his medication and said the heart was stable, compensating well, no significant deterioration. Don Evaristo said, "How long?" The cardiologist said there was no way to know. Don Evaristo said he appreciated the honesty. Marisol, sitting in the waiting room, looked up when he came out and read something in his face and said nothing until they were in the truck, and then said, "Good news or bad news?" "Neither," he said. "True news." She drove. They stopped at a bakery in Jico on the way back and bought pan de yema, the egg yolk bread from the bakery that had been operating out of the same building since 1934, and ate it in the truck outside the building before driving the last stretch home, because some things deserve to be eaten immediately rather than carried. The 5th anniversary of their arrival, which nobody formally counted but everybody knew, came in October of the 5th year, during the harvest, and passed without ceremony because there was a harvest happening and nobody had time for ceremony. Tomas was 17, Lucia was 14, Rafa was 9. Don Evaristo was 83. Can Ra di Anlan. The March of the 6th year was dry, in the way that March is sometimes dry in the Veracruz highlands. Not catastrophically, but with a settled mineral quality to the air that made the distances look very clear. The coffee plants, between harvests, stood in the particular repose of plants that have given what they had and are now gathering for the next season. The mules grazed in the lower meadow. The stream was lower than usual, but running clear. Don Evaristo had been slower since January. Not a dramatic change, not a new event, not a crisis, but a settling, the way a house settles after years of finding its position in the earth. He woke later. He walked to the porch rather than to the fields. He sat with his coffee in the morning and watched the hill come into light, which had always been the most reliable thing in his life, and still was. He had asked Tomas in February to go through the ledger with him from the beginning, not to find errors, but to go through it. They had spent 4 evenings at the desk together, turning the pages from 40 years ago forward, and Don Evaristo had explained things as they went. What a drought year looked like in the numbers, what a good price year looked like, what the cost of the first mule purchase had been in 1981, and what the equivalent mule would cost now. Tomas asked questions and took notes, and said at the end of the last evening, "You should write this down. The things you know that aren't in the numbers." Don Evaristo said he would think about it. He did not write it down. He told it, instead, to Tomas while they walked the property, to Rafa while they sat in the lower field watching a grafted plant that was taking hold, to Lucia while she worked the loom and he sat in the chair in the doorway of what had been Remedios's room and was now, gradually, becoming Lucia's room too. The stones on the windowsill and the weaving books on the shelf alongside the old books that had always been there. He told it in pieces, not as a lecture, just as the natural spillage of a man who knows that what he carries needs to go somewhere. On the morning of the 15th of March, he did not come to the kitchen. Marisol knocked on his door at 5:45 when the clay pot coffee was ready, and he had not appeared, which had not happened before. He said, "Come in," and she came in and found him sitting up in the bed, not in distress, not alarmed, simply sitting up with his hands in his lap and looking at the window where the pre-dawn gray was beginning to separate from the darkness. "I don't think I'll get up today," he said. She sat in the chair beside the bed, the chair that lived there because she had moved it there in the 2nd year without being asked, and nobody had moved it back, and poured him coffee from the cup she had brought. He drank it. They sat together in the room while the light changed. By 7, Tomas was at the door. He came in and sat on the edge of the bed, and did not say anything superfluous, which was characteristic of him. By 7:30, Rafa was there too, sitting on the floor with his back against the bed in the way he had sat on the porch floor beside Don Evaristo's feet on the first night, which neither of them mentioned but which Don Evaristo noticed.
Lucia came and stood in the doorway, and then came in and sat in the window chair, and Marisol moved to the foot of the bed, and all of them were in the room, and it was quiet. The morning light on the hillside came through the window at the angle it came at this hour in March, making the coffee plants on the slope look like they were leaning slightly into the warmth. Don Evaristo looked at Tomas. "The ledger," he said. His voice was lower than usual, but even. "I have it," Tomas said. "The east field will need pruning in April, not before." "I know," Tomas said. "I'll wait for April." Don Evaristo was quiet for a moment. He looked at Lucia. "The loom," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at Rafa, who was looking up at him from the floor with the serious, unfrightened attention that he had brought to everything since the first night. "The rust," Don Evaristo said. "I check every week," Rafa said. "East lower field and the section above the stream." "Good," Don Evaristo said. He looked at Marisol. She was looking at him with the eyes she had had on the first day at the gate. Tired, yes, in the way that comes from carrying something a long time. But underneath it, the thing that had not been extinguished, the stubbornness that is the particular form of love that does not look away. He said, "Tell them the land is theirs, not because I gave it." He took a breath. "Because they earned it, every morning of it." "I'll tell them," she said. "But they already know." He was quiet after that for a while. Rafa's hand found his on the blanket, not dramatically, just placed there, the way Rafa did things, without ceremony and without explanation. The light moved across the wall. Don Evaristo Salinas died before the morning was finished, in his own bed, in his own house, surrounded by the people who had come to him 14 kilometers on foot with a chest and 3 children, and a proposition that was not a plea. He did not die alone. He had not been alone since October, 5.5 years before. They buried him in the churchyard in Chico, next to Remedios, in the plot he had arranged for himself the year after she died. The carving on the stone was simple, his name, the dates, and below them, because Tomas had insisted on one more line and had written it out and given it to the stonecutter himself. Trabajó esta tierra con sus manos y la entregó con el corazón. He worked this land with his hands and gave it with his heart. The harvest that October was the best the property had ever recorded. 4,820 kilograms of premium Arabica from the upper fields alone, plus the microlot sale to the Mexico City roaster that Tomas had arranged in August at a price that made the cooperative buyer shake his head in a way that was more admiration than complaint. Lucia sold the last of her woven pieces from the market in Chico in October and used part of the money to buy a second loom, not for herself, but for the community weaving group she had been meeting with on Wednesday evenings at the secondary school. Rafa, 9 years old, and the designated custodian of the east lower field and the section above the stream, checked both sections every week without fail through the following dry season, and reported no rust, which was the correct report. He reported it to Tomas, who wrote it in the ledger in the column Rafa had asked him to create, called simply Estado del Campo, state of the field. The blue tablecloth stayed on the dining room table for everyday use, the way Lucia had decided it should be used. It had been washed many times now, and the color had softened slightly, and the third section, where the original thread had broken and Lucia had adapted, was, with washing, barely distinguishable from the rest. On Christmas Eve, Marisol set the pollo and mole verde on the table, and they all sat down. Marisol at one end, the children in the places they had always occupied, and the chair at the head of the table was not filled, and it was not empty either. It held what it held. Outside, the hillside in December had its usual quiet. Harvest done, plants resting, mist coming down from the upper slopes. The 14 mules in the lower meadow stood in their customary formation near the shelter of the tepejilote palm, in the way they had stood every December for as long as anyone on the property could remember. The lamp in the office was on.
The ledger was open on the desk. The land went on.
So tell me, which moment touched your heart the most? Was it the night little Rafa sat down on the porch floor beside Don Evaristo's feet without a word, and the two of them just looked out at the darkness together? Was it the moment Lucia held the key to the locked room in her hand and put it back in his pocket without turning it? Or was it the morning Don Evaristo spread the finished blue tablecloth on the table himself, smoothing the edges the way Remedios used to,
And nobody said a word because nobody needed to? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story touched your soul, subscribe to Alma en Historias, because there is always a story waiting for you here.